as well. Good evening, everyone, to our distinguished guests. I know that many of you are joining from around the world and from some key organizations who have been advocating for human rights in Afghanistan as well. My name is Shabnam Nasimi, and I'm honored to welcome you to today's crucial discussion that will focus on a nation grappling with one of the world's most alarming human rights situations. Here at the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan, we are committed to fostering understanding, dialogue, and actionable insights into Afghanistan's complex situation. We do believe that it is imperative that conferences and dialogues and platforms on Afghanistan should not be the same as the ones we've seen so often since 2001. In order to build a coherent platform of opposition voices, Afghanistan's most competent diaspora and civil society around the globe in the US, Britain, and Europe must be involved in all conversations. We do hope that we can build a civic platform for dialogue that looks at an alternative, non-violent pathway for a country that has already experienced 46 years of war, started by the USSR in 1978. This is an opportunity for us to focus on the concept of nothing about us without us. And to remind our viewers, our last session was with Professor Thomas Barfield, a renowned anthropologist on Afghanistan. And if you've missed it, it is available on our YouTube page. We're honored to have joining us today Mr. Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. His role is essentially and especially crucial in light of the recent report by Mr. Feridun Sinirlioglu, the UN Special Coordinator in Afghanistan, which is based on the realities on the ground, and many have claimed can help with solving some of the current challenges in the country. As many of you may be aware, we will be commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this Sunday. And the webinar today will hopefully delve into how the Taliban's return in Afghanistan on August 2021 has not only reversed decades of progress in human rights, but also poses new challenges for the international community in its efforts to support the people of Afghanistan. And as we engage with Mr. Bennett this evening, let us be mindful of the gravity of our conversation. We are not just exchanging views, we are addressing a humanitarian and human rights crisis that demands our immediate attention and action. The plight of those suffering under the Taliban's rule, as vividly detailed in Mr. Sinirlioglu's report, calls for our unwavering commitment to human dignity and justice. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions prior to today's event. This webinar will be approximately an hour long, and while noting that the session is titled Gender Apartheid and Human Rights in Afghanistan, we will also look at how we can keep the spotlight on the country and addressing relevant issues for the UK to consider, including accountability. Among other human rights issues, we will discuss the situation of women and girls, the lack of rule of law, exclusion and discrimination of many groups, including ethnic and religious groups in Afghanistan, as well as the LGBTQ plus, and access to economic, social, and cultural rights. Any unanswered questions will be addressed in future conversations, so please do bear with us. I'll dive straight in, Mr. Bennett. Welcome and thank you so much for your time. Since your appointment on April 2022, and given your recent visits to Afghanistan and your extensive work on monitoring the situation of human rights in the country, I'm hoping you can paint a picture for all of us what life looks like in Afghanistan today, especially in the context of human rights and the landscape.
Well, good evening, Shabnam, and good evening, Conservative Friends of Afghanistan. I'm delighted to join you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Shabnam, for your comprehensive introduction that I think really sets the scene for this conversation. Life in Afghanistan today, well, I think you're probably better off asking Afghans who are living there as to how they experience it. But I can describe what I've seen in my visits. I've been not only to Kabul, I've been to several of the provinces, including Kandahar, Bamiyan, Mazar-e Sharif, that is Balkh province, and Panjshir, as well as Kabul. I think what's important to remember is that there are multiple and intersecting crises in Afghanistan. Certainly one that takes the forefront, as it should do, is the impact of the rule of the Taliban. And I think all conservative friends will know that this group is not a recognized government. At the UN, it's termed a de facto authority. And of course, it is an autocratic regime, or at least moving in that direction, because it has abolished the constitution, as it has the parliament and the electoral system, and many other institutions, including the Human Rights Commission, and has replaced the Ministry of Women's Affairs with the Department for the Prevention of Vice and the Promotion of Virtue. I could go on. But when I mention intersecting crises, there's also been crises caused by more natural events. There's been droughts. There's been 2 sets of serious earthquakes since the Taliban took over, one in the east and the other in the west more recently. And so for any government, it would have been a very challenging period. And in addition to that, the economy has taken a big hit because of the way in which the Taliban took power. The banking system has been cut off from the international community. Afghanistan's assets have been frozen. And so there are a lot of restrictions, and this impacts on the people of Afghanistan, who suffer a humanitarian crisis as well as a political one and a human rights crisis. But as many of you will know, and perhaps especially you, Shabnam, Afghans are very resilient people. And for many of them, life goes on, and they find ways to survive, to continue doing their businesses, and to finding ways of earning a living and living as normal a life as they can. Of course, many of them have left the country. Some have come to the UK, and I think that's an ongoing issue. But many more have crossed a border into a neighboring country, such as Pakistan or Iran, or in the north, Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, for example. And so I think it's the several million Afghans have crossed the border since the Taliban took over, and some of them are now being pushed back, particularly from Pakistan, but also we note pushbacks from Iran and from Turkey as well. What I noticed moving around the country was it was quieter. Certainly, one can move around because there is not the same intensity of a war. Yeah. But the roads are quieter also because of lack of money and because many people have left, a kind of brain drain. The markets are still functioning. There is a food crisis in Afghanistan, but largely that's not because of a lack of food. It's a lack of money to buy food. There's food in the market. People don't have cash to spend. So, and then when it comes to the situation of women and girls, I'm sure all of the friends who have joined will have read about or will know an Afghan or be aware of how the Taliban have really clamped down and imposed a system of widespread discrimination against women and girls. Perhaps most notoriously, they have closed schools and universities, schools above 6th grade for girls, and have also restricted women's ability in employment. Certainly employment in the government has been cut back a lot, not completely. There are still women who are working in some sectors, for example, the security sector, and also in health and in education. But for non-governmental organizations, they've been banned even from the UN as well. The private sector is a bit more open, and there is still a flourishing chamber of commerce, including women. But even in the private sector, we do hear of some restrictions. For example, I think in August, beauty salons were closed with a loss of around 70,000 jobs for women. That was kind of in the opposite direction of what the Taliban have been saying about being open to private sector. And many people assessed that the reason for doing it was that it was seen as a kind of a comfortable social space for women that they wanted to deny women. So I think that's kind of a picture I've tried to paint, but I'm sure we can go into more depth in certain issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. You've mentioned the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan as one of the key human rights violations since the Taliban takeover. I mean, we know that gender-based discrimination exists almost in every country. Gender-based persecution exists in many countries, but gender apartheid is different. Apartheid is a system that is imposed and enforced by the people in power. Do you believe there is a gender apartheid system or regime in Afghanistan today?
Well, together with the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, I researched, visited Afghanistan, and drafted a report tabled in the Human Rights Council in June this year, where we assessed the entire situation as much as we could for women and girls in Afghanistan. And we did conclude that both gender persecution and gender apartheid are concerns. And maybe just to say that, to explain the difference between these two concepts. As you pointed out, Shabnam, gender persecution does exist elsewhere, and it's recognized as an international crime. In fact, a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And persecution in that statute is defined as the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group. And in this case, we assess that women and girls are targeted for gender persecution because of their sex characteristics, and because, I mean, to get technical, the social constructs and criteria used to define gender roles. So yeah, we also noted that not just women and girls, but anyone can be targeted for gender persecution. Men and boys, and also gender diverse and non-binary persons could be. And already this could, the Taliban could be held to account for this by the International Criminal Court, and I understand that they are seriously looking into this. Whereas gender apartheid, which was first, kind of the framing was first used in the 1990s, to characterize the situation under Taliban rule, is not included in the Rome Statute or in any international law. Apartheid has a history that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, which is associated with race discrimination. It's associated with an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one group over another group, with the intention of maintaining that regime. Now, if one replaces race with gender in that definition, we reached a conclusion that it's an accurate description of the situation documented in the report that we wrote. Now, having said that, it's not yet an international law, and there are some campaigns to try to introduce this into international law. I could go into that in more detail, but maybe I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you then tell me whether you think the international community has done enough to respond to the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan, or have they simply given up? And why is it that there's been no shift in policy towards women and girls, despite the ongoing negotiations, dialogue, and engagement with the Taliban over the last 2 years?
Over the last 2 years, the Taliban have issued a series of decrees and edicts and instructions which have step by step reduced the freedom of women and girls in Afghanistan, moving it back to the situation of the 1990s, not yet as far as the 1990s, but certainly in that direction. There have been 1 or 2 decrees which could be seen as more positive, banning forced marriage, for example. But in general, it's been a very negative trend without much sign of change. Having said that, one hears about a kind of variety of views among the Taliban leadership, and that some of them don't agree with all of these restrictions, and including particularly the barring or the suspension of girls from education, because they say it's only a suspension. But we haven't really seen any kind of loosening, not formally anyway. Informally, I'm told that different Afghan women and different groups find workarounds, so they are able to continue to work or do business or get some education, but only through finding space in creative and ingenious ways. Does pressure work? Well, the international community has put on pressure in the sense that many countries have refused to deal with the Taliban. They have cut their aid. They won't make any steps towards recognition around largely this issue of the treatment of women and girls. Is it working? Is the status quo working? Well, you mentioned the report of Mr. Sinioglu at the beginning in your introduction, and he actually begins the report by saying the status quo is not working. And he then goes on to propose a kind of a roadmap towards where he sees the end point being the integration of Afghanistan. He doesn't say the Taliban, by the way. Some people have misread that. He talks about the integration of the state of Afghanistan back into the international community, and conditions of it. I don't think he uses the word conditions. He talks about incentives and benchmarks, but around a number of factors, but particularly the recognition, not just recognition, but compliance with international human rights treaties, and particularly the equality of women and men.
I mean, you mentioned the recent report by Mr. Sinioglu who is the UN Special Coordinator, and the findings that he has come up with. How do you think these findings will influence future engagements with the Taliban? And additionally, considering actually the Islamic Republic's, the Emirates' response to the report, where they expressed a willingness to accept recommendations that strengthen Afghanistan's national economy and regional connectivity, how can these elements be leveraged to advocate for improved human rights conditions in the country?
Well, I think it's what I think we're waiting to see is how the Security Council will respond to Mr. Santiago's report. He was mandated by the Security Council. He was appointed by the Secretary General and makes the report to the Security Council. And thus far, we've not heard what that response will be. My guess, because it can only be a guess at this stage, is that I think they are quite likely to pick up on his recommendation for the appointment of a special envoy to take this forward, together with what he calls a contact group of international community. But the report itself is quite broad brush, and I think deliberately so, and that the implementation of his recommendations, if in fact it's decided to implement them, I think will be a lot more work on both sides. How is the international community, how are member states going to engage, but also, as you pointed out, how are the Taliban going to respond? And I think there's going to be a lot more water under that bridge before we really begin to see what might be the path forward. And I think really it looks to me like quite a long process. And we don't even know what degree of appetite or enthusiasm there would be on either side. And all I would say is the importance of the inclusion, the meaningful inclusion of Afghan women and girls in any process, and the absolute insistence on respect for human rights, including women's rights.
Just before I move on to the next question, and we can start discussing other elements of human rights concerns in Afghanistan, I want to just press you on the comment you've just made in terms of the fact that this is going to be a long process. What does this mean when it comes to women's rights? Are we, I mean, as you know, the Taliban in the late 1990s were in power for about 6 years, and during that entire period, women were practically erased from society. How long do you foresee these conversations being had before any sort of impact or outcome when it comes to women's rights?
I hope that there are changes immediately, tomorrow, starting with the reopening of education for women and girls, and education up to a decent international standard, much more than simply reopening the doors. And I think there are concerns about what might be happening to the curriculum, to the content of education as well. So nothing needs to wait for a political process. There ought to be a political process, in my view, but the human rights changes, the changes that are essential as building blocks, should start immediately, should start tomorrow. And in addition to the opening of education institutions, economic opportunities ought to be opened up again to women and girls.
Just to make a quick comment to the audience, please feel free to send your questions to the Q&A option on Zoom, and we'll take that towards the end of session. But building on our discussion of human rights, as you know, Pakistan has recently decided to deport over 1.7 million refugees back to Afghanistan, and we are witnessing significant shifts in the regional refugee dynamics. Can you discuss the impacts of such a large-scale displacement on human rights in Afghanistan, particularly in light of reports that ethnic Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks are being also forcefully displaced within Afghanistan to accommodate those returning from Pakistan and other Taliban members? How does this complex situation affect both those returning refugees and the communities facing internal displacement? And what are the broader implications for human rights and stability in the region?
Well, first of all, millions of Afghans left the country for a reason. They didn't leave the country because they, most of them, I think, because they particularly chose to or wanted to. And they, we really don't accept that the conditions in which they are being, some of them not even returned, some of them have lived their whole lives in Afghanistan, but asked to move back are voluntary. Not all may be deportations, but they are certainly under pressure. So first of all, it creates a massive upheaval of people's lives in Pakistan, some of whom have been there for many years. And I just want to emphasize that from the reports that I'm aware of and from talking to people, it's not just the Afghans who moved 2 years ago. It's Afghans who may have lived for decades in Pakistan but haven't got the proper documentation, who are also being asked to uproot, move back, leave their homes, abandon their businesses, not able to bring their money. And this creates a huge humanitarian crisis, another one, on the long-suffering people of Afghanistan. And then secondly, there are the fact that there is a lack of screening. In fact, today I issued a press statement on this together with some other mandate holders of the UN, and it's tantamount to refoulement. There is no screening out people who may be subject to persecution or other extreme forms of risk. So, you know, this is not legal, although Pakistan has not ratified the Refugee Convention. It has ratified the Convention Against Torture, and is responsible to avoid refoulement. So both the humanitarian and human rights issues. You mentioned the possibility of kind of social engineering, if I put it in those terms, inside Afghanistan, taking advantage of that. I think that there are some reports, but I believe that would need more study before I express a view about that. But there are risks to Afghans. There is ill treatment on the Pakistan side of the border, and concerns on the Afghanistan side as well. And, you know, in terms of what's behind this, why now, after Pakistan has hosted millions of Afghans for decades, you know, they do, you know, I think the Pakistan government has, Minister of Interior has announced that they are not happy with their view that the Taliban are hosting, the Afghan Taliban within, hosting the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban, within the borders of Afghanistan. And although that's denied on the Afghanistan side. And also, I think it's important to recall that this is an election time period, and there's an interim government in Pakistan. They've also claimed that Afghan immigrants are disproportionately responsible for crime and terrorism and incidents of terrorism in their country. And so it's a kind of fertile ground for stigmatizing and putting additional pressure on Afghans.
On that note, I think there was a question that came from the audience on this as well. Before we move on to a different aspect of human rights, there have been discussions. I think there have been reports from a number of Afghan press and media where footage has been sent around forceful displacement inside Afghanistan. And I know that that a lot more research needs to be done here. But is that something that the UN is willing to consider and look at more closely? As you know, the ethnic dynamic and the religious dynamic of Afghanistan is rather complex, and it's been going on for a very long time. And there have been a lot of suggestions that the Taliban are fueling this tension and division. Is that something that the UN is looking at?
I can't speak for the whole UN. But it's something that my office is looking at, yes. We have been looking at it for a while. I have reported on this almost throughout my tenure. I started reporting on it in September last year, and have expressed concerns several times about different forms of pressure put on religious and ethnic communities in Afghanistan. We're well aware of the targeting through bombing and so on, and of different communities, certainly Shia communities, but we've also seen other Sikh and Sufi communities affected, and others. So from time to time, in fact, perhaps more often than not, claimed by Daesh, by ISKP, but certainly the protection of those communities leaves a lot to be desired, and I've drawn that to the attention of the de facto authorities, both in private and in public. And I do think that this long-standing issue needs further investigation. When you refer to current situation in Pakistan and that, I think I would say that it requires more study. I'm also aware that in the UK Parliament there has been a degree of examination of the situation of Hazara in particular in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so really I would only say that, we should remain concerned about religious freedoms and ethnic equality, and keep the spotlight on the need for an inclusive country in Afghanistan, a pluralistic and diverse one where no one is left behind.
Thank you. Just moving on slightly from those within the Taliban regime, and looking at the more complex tapestry of groups within Afghanistan and the Afghan community, both those in exile now and those in diaspora. I mean, fixing a country's troubling trajectory is not an easy task, and it's not something that Afghanistan has been very successful in the past. And now we've seen more than 2 years gone by since the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan, and yet those who are looking at forming some sort of an alternative pathway we are still fighting around factionalism concerning notions that are being expressed, infighting. What do you think that the solution here is, and is it something that your office and the UN more generally could look at when it comes to including others, those within from the former government, those who talents and those in exile outside the country, and those within who want to return back to Afghanistan and be part of a future for that for that nation? Is there an opportunity that could be set up, and what sort of support or lending hand can the UN play here? I perhaps need to clarify that my own mandate, of course, is on human rights, and the Human Rights Council, prefers to focus it on the present to see what can be done to improve the rights of Afghans. But at the same time, as you said in your introduction, and again,
alluded to now, Afghanistan has suffered 45 years of devastating conflict, and part of that I think can be attributed to interventions by the international community, but not all of it. And I think it is extremely critical for the future of the country. And this is where I think Mr. Sinioglu talked about the need for an intra-Afghan dialogue. He didn't go into much detail about how that would work, but I think what he was hinting at was kind of precisely what you have talked about as well. And many of us who are not Afghans, and I'm one who have said that, look, the long-term solutions need to come from Afghans, both in the country and the diaspora as well. So getting, I also think, we talked about Afghanistan being a very diverse country. And, it's 40 million people. You're not going to have everyone agreeing. It's 2/3 of the population of the UK. And can you imagine, in the UK, everybody agreeing? But there's a difference between that and finding ways to respect each other and to live together in a durable peace. And that's not happening yet. I don't think there is peace in Afghanistan. And there's going to be a long road to that. Now, this gets kind of out of my mandate in a way into much more of a political dialogue. But I think to bring it back, what I think needs to be done is to kind of respect fundamental human rights values, which I think are probably not that different from Afghan values. I know that sometimes people query human rights and they say this is some kind of Western intervention. I mean, even the Taliban do that from time to time. They're not the only ones. But I think if you reframe it into language around dignity and fairness and allowing for space and equality, then then I think it begins to make more sense. Where I think we have more difficulty is if one group insists that they're always right and that they're superior. And we've talked about that in gender terms already. And that's really just not acceptable in today's world and in human rights terms at all. And so I think it's essential to move beyond that.
On the note of living respectfully with dignity and with human rights, as you know, the absence of the rule of law under the Taliban regime in Afghanistan has led to unchecked and unreported violation of human rights and a culture of impunity. In this context, Mr. Bennett, what practical measures do you think could be taken by international bodies to enforce the rule of law and ensure the protection of human rights of all citizens of Afghanistan, especially the most vulnerable groups?
I mean, I think at the international level, Afghanistan ought to be held to account. We've already mentioned the International Criminal Court, which we know is investigating Afghanistan. But maybe there are other ways on gender justice, for example. You mentioned gender apartheid. There's also some interest in using the International Court of Justice. And so there are other ways as well. There's the Security Council, which has powers, including sanctions and other powers. There's the Human Rights Council, which has more persuasive powers. But for example, the Universal Periodic Review is coming up in a few months in the Human Rights Council for Afghanistan. So there are some kind of international mechanisms, but really the change needs to happen domestically in Afghanistan, which is still has no constitution, Which laws still apply or don't is pretty murky, pretty unknown as far as I can tell. There's and this is not my area, but there's really a certain version of Hanafi jurisprudence being applied that a number of other scholars disagree with. And there's, as you mentioned, the rule of law, the judiciary that existed in the past was completely removed, including all the women. Taliban see no role for women. The laws that were in place to protect women from violence were taken away. And so that also needs to be put in place. And I think it's the thing is the international community does have some tools. One thing, it can offer incentives, and it can also offer conditions in a way. Although, as I mentioned, Mr. Senioglu provided a roadmap with some benchmarks and incentives. And we'll have to see how the international community, how the member states decide to put on that pressure, because it's not easy to bring about change. My reports do touch a nerve. And, does that help or not? I know that they touch a nerve because of the kind of reaction that they get. So they're read, they're not liked. I don't write them to be liked. I write them because I want to set out the facts and make recommendations for improvements. Behind the scenes, are they having an impact? I don't know. But I think we need to keep on insisting on the standards that are absolutely necessary to be a full member of the international community.
You mentioned the point that the Taliban do need to be held to account. How do you think we can keep the spotlight on Afghanistan, and what relevant issues are there for the UK, especially to consider, including the notion of accountability?
Well, I think there is a lot of unfortunate competition for the spotlight. We've got the Middle East, we've got Ukraine, we've got parts of Africa, where there are also crises. And it's hard to keep attention on a country for a long period of time. And I think, though, that unfortunately, the kind of signature issue for Afghanistan is that the blatant discrimination, deliberate sidelining of women and girls create distances this country from others, and I think focusing on that does help keep the spotlight on. However, it's not enough. There are many other human rights violations going on, some of which we've touched on tonight, and I haven't even mentioned about the disappearances, the arbitrary detentions, the torture, and so on that is also taking place, and the huge clampdown on women protesters. There's a raft of issues. So I think it is important to not for Afghanistan not to be forgotten, including by the UK. There was a massive investment in Afghanistan over decades by the UK. When it comes to accountability, I do think that that the shoe is on both feet in this case. I don't think we can only talk about accountability for a couple of groups over the last couple of years, that is the Taliban and IS. I think it's really important to look back further over decades as to there's been almost complete impunity as to who is responsible for what. And the UK isn't excluded from that, frankly. And I think it's a step forward when countries begin to look at themselves, because one of the things that I am accused of when I meet officials in Afghanistan is double standards. why are you putting, holding us to a greater level of expectation than you do other countries? So I think national inquiries, whether they're in the UK or Australia or Germany or wherever, I think send a signal that, no, the standards are the same for everyone, and the rules are the same, and all those who seriously transgress international human rights law and criminal law will be held to account.
Thank you so much, Richard. I think we have less than 10 minutes to take a few questions from the audience, and we'll try to take as many as we can. Please, Richard, feel free to give very short and brief responses so that I can take in a few before we let you go. One of the questions that I've seen come from the audience that I think a lot of people have also been asking is the role that grassroots and local organizations and movements play in Afghanistan, including those who are providing underground education, those who are supporting civil society rights, and particularly women's-led organizations. How could international entities support these local efforts whilst the Taliban are still in power, in order to ensure that before we see any sort of change in their policies towards not only women but generally around human rights, how can we provide that support system to make sure that those sort of networks and grassroots-led movements persist and continue to be empowered in some ways?
Well, first of all, I'd say that those movements and activities are no substitute for a country that is governed in a rights-respecting way. However, I do think that the thirst among Afghans still in the country for education and for economic opportunities, to give two examples, do need to be supported, and where that can be done through whatever it is, through by remote means or by grassroots means, I think that ought to be supported. And one of the reasons is not only that it substantively helps people economically and through education, but it helps the mental health of Afghans. I think, I hear a lot of Afghans who are, desperately depressed and unhappy, especially women, but men too. And if some of these programs can give them a kind of a slightly more fulfilling life, being able to have some opportunities, I think it will have not only economic benefits, but benefits to the mental health of Afghan people as well.
There's another question that focuses a little bit more on the concept of gender apartheid, where you mentioned this briefly at the beginning. The question is whether you can elaborate very quickly on the campaigns that are currently underway to incorporate the concept of gender apartheid into international law. Is that taking place?
Yeah, it is taking place. And I think there's two ways to look at this gender apartheid issue. One is, as you've said, the incorporation into international law. It's not yet international law. It's also a kind of rallying cry, a kind of advocacy movement. It's, if you like, even a label, because it sends a certain message, and a lot of Afghans feel that this is the only way, the best way to describe what's happening, whether or not it's in law. The second is, in the law, there is currently being developed a new treaty on crimes against humanity. At the moment, that draft does not include gender apartheid as one of the crimes against humanity, and there is a movement to have it inserted into that. Now, that's going to take a while, these treaties take a lot of negotiating, but there is a strong move to have gender apartheid included in this treaty. But there's also other movements, and one of them I'm involved in the sense that the Human Rights Council has mandated me, working with other UN mechanisms, to write a new report, this time not using the term gender apartheid in the mandate, but what they asked me to research and write about is, quote, the phenomenon of an institutionalized system of discrimination, segregation, excuse me, disrespect for human dignity and exclusion of women and girls. And I'll be working on that till June next year. And this is another track because there'll be the report going to the Human Rights Council on this. I mentioned the International Court of Justice, not specifically on gender apartheid, but there are thoughts about suing Afghanistan, that is one country, not individuals, but one country suing another country for violations of their international commitments, in this case, on women's rights. So there are other forms of litigation. Now, one of the differences between gender apartheid and gender persecution is that gender persecution is aimed at individuals. Gender apartheid also aimed at whole states. And this notion would mean that if we think about the situation in South Africa some decades ago, that countries that are complicit with an apartheid regime are in violation of their international treaties. So it would put pressure on the UK and other countries, including on businesses, for example, in relation to their dealings with Afghanistan in the future. There's some way to go on this, but there is quite a lot of tension on it right now. Even yesterday in South Africa, and of course, when we think of apartheid, that's where we think of. There was the annual Nelson Mandela Memorial Lecture. And this year it was delivered by Malala Yousafzai, and she, the topic of her lecture was gender apartheid in Afghanistan.
Apologies for that. Thank you, Richard. I think I'll take one final question, and this will be focusing a little bit more on whether you believe, through all of your efforts and the work that you've been doing, which is incredibly commendable, and I'm sure the people of Afghanistan, whether they're inside or outside, are thankful for your ongoing commitment to addressing the human rights concerns inside the country, which is one of the worst in the world. But from your experience and from your own personal views, do you think the Taliban are a reformable organization? Have you observed any change in their behavior during your visits to Afghanistan? Since they took control, is there any element when it comes to a group that is driven by, in some ways, extremist ideologies towards the women and girls of the country, but also political opponents, those who differ in their vision for the country? Is there any hope to see the Taliban lift restrictions and look at engaging with other groups within the country?
I think there's different ways of looking at it. If one views the Taliban as a fledgling theocracy, one doesn't need to look very far to another country to see how that has gone for decades. On the other hand, there are views that the Taliban is a much more kind of ideological or political organization. And as we've seen in Afghanistan over decades and decades, Afghan politics tends to be subject to change quite quickly. So I think, really the jury's still out on that. And I think it's the people of Afghanistan, it's the constituency of Afghans who will make a difference, in particular youth, different groups. We haven't talked much about youth, but I think that young, new generation are different and will gain in influence and power. I think also on kind of the other end of the scale, in a way, the religious scholars, the mullahs in Afghanistan, and especially at community level, will not necessarily, in the long term, accept the restrictions or the particular interpretations of Sharia that are being imposed. So I do think that pressure may, even though the Taliban says they don't react to pressure, but I think that these internal dynamics, not just the international pressure, may bring about change. And as I said, I have enormous respect for Afghans to come together and to find a path forward. I think what I can do is continue to assess, to observe, assess, document, including document the violations for future accountability, and speak out, and also speak out not on behalf of Afghans, because as Afghans you have your own voice, but speak out to amplify your voices as to what's going on and the suggestions for the way forward, always emphasizing the primacy of human rights and equality for everyone, irrespective of your gender or your religious or ethnic background or whatever group you may be associated with.
Thank you so much. As we bring our discussion to a close, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to you, Mr. Richard Bennett, for your insightful contributions, and to all of those who've engaged and participated today. Hopefully this conversation has shed some light on the complex and urgent human rights issues facing Afghanistan, reminding us of the critical work that lie ahead. I hope that we do carry forward your comments and feedback and perspectives that you've shared with us today in our continued efforts to advocate and support the people of Afghanistan in their pursuit for dignity, peace, and human rights. Thank you again all for joining. The footage for this conversation will be available on YouTube, so those who weren't able to join hopefully will be able to listen in at a later time. I do hope to see many of our guests again in our sessions in the new year around the perspectives on Afghanistan series. But thank you again and have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much, Shabnam, everyone, for joining. I do hope that the UK keeps engaging with and the spotlight on Afghanistan. And as we come to the end of 2023, I wish everyone a wonderful holiday and a happy new year.
Thank you so much. You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.